This book is one of the few books I've ever read that has the potential to be transformative, both on the personal level, but also on the societal level. And it's a really long book. It's actually 2 volumes. I read this at 6 pages a day because it's so profound. You kind of have to read 6 pages and sleep on it and absorb it for a while and then move on to the next 6 pages. This took me like 7 months to read. But it is a spiritual journey. It really does change how you think about the world and give you hope in a way that almost nothing else I've read recently it does. I actually think this is the paradigm shift that we need. And this channel is all about paradigm shifts in economics, governance, and knowledge systems. And this book essentially it answers the question, the paradigm shift in service to what? To what ends do we want to transform our systems? And it can't just be away from something. It can't just be away from power dominance and concentrating power, which it does have to be those things. But it needs to be toward something better. And that toward something better is captured by this framework he lays out, which is essentially toward the things that are most meaningful and beautiful and valuable, the things that have inherent value in the world. That's what it's toward. And in reading this, it was almost like I've felt like there's this Overton window, where an Overton window is sort of the bounds on appropriate conversation. What can you talk about, and what are things that are beyond what's really appropriate to talk about? And I've kind of felt like talking about the most meaningful things possible, beauty and purpose and all that, is a little bit beyond the bounds of the Overton window. And in some ways, this book has given me language where I feel like, okay, I can take this and start to open that Overton window to include those things that really matter in a way that I was having trouble doing before the book gave me language. And if we try to describe what is wrong with the world right now, what is the matter with things, and the title has multiple meanings, but if we try to describe that intuitively, there are kind of 2 images that I have seen popping up in multiple arenas, where one is, it feels like we're living inside a machine. It feels like we're living inside a system that is incapable of perceiving real value. And I think a healthcare system is one example of this, where you get trapped in the healthcare system and you feel like nobody actually sees you and the specific pain you have. It feels like the system is just trying to fit you into these boxes and put you into these machine-like ways of moving through an assembly line with all of these cogs, none of which are actually aware of what matters. And then the second analogy that you hear popping up is it feels like we're living inside a mad mind. And an example here is sort of schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia are oftentimes really super hyper logical, where it's like A leads to B leads to C. This is a logical progression. And sometimes the way they'll talk fits into these super logical models of the world. And yet, they can often be very profoundly out of touch with reality at the same time. Like those 2 things are juxtaposed sometimes in some versions or some manifestations of schizophrenia. And essentially it's like if society has its own personality and its own mind, it's like, okay, wait, are we living in a society that has some variation of schizophrenia or is moving in that direction? And both of these, I think, are validated and explained in a really important way in this book. So my goal here is to give you a taste of what this is about, to hopefully inspire you to read it. I also want to sort of lay some groundwork because I plan to build on this channel as I'm thinking through the paradigm shifts I'm thinking through. And then my hope is by the end of the video, you understand why I think in some ways this is the societal myth that could actually transform. And this is because it's a narrative that is deeply grounded in science. And yet it helps us to grapple with that which science cannot access. That's one part of the story. It also gives us a framework that does not reject religions and replace them with a new religion that can come in and everybody's afraid of the dogmatic version of that religion. Instead, it rejects dogmatic versions of all religions, including atheism and secular types of religions. And yet it doesn't force all religions to be exactly equal. So I think that's really profound. And then the third reason I think this is the myth that could actually transform society is because this is a story that we are all called into. It's not something that you have to have access to seats of power in society to enact and to embody. It's something that everybody can pick up and move into wherever they are in the world. And that if enough people did this, I think that would transform society. And they can do this from their own unique vantage point. So that's why I was so excited about this book. So where I'm going with this, I first just want to lay out his thesis and then talk a little bit about my experience of it. I want to talk about the methodology he uses to approach this. Then I'll very briefly go through the broad sections of his book, where one of the sections really looks at how do we understand reality, given that reality is kind of slippery and difficult to grasp and paradoxical. And the four ways of approaching reality he identifies are science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And then the next volume really lays out what is a framework for understanding reality, how should we think about what reality is. And then I just want to end by coming back to this notion of the story or the narrative that we are called into. Now, I'm going to identify two parts to his thesis, where the first has to do with the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And if someone were to ask, what is the book about? You could even say it's about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. I think that would be insufficient, but it's not too off base. And one initially puzzling feature of both the human brain and also animal brains is that the two hemispheres are actually kept fairly separate. There's not as many connections across the hemispheres as there is within a hemisphere. And as a matter of fact, parts of the brain actually inhibit communication between the two halves. So the question is, what is going on there? And the way he describes this is it's about two different types of attention a person can pay to the world. And he gives this bird analogy where a bird has two tasks. One task is to get the worm. And in order to get the worm, the bird needs a very focused kind of attention. And yet, the bird also has to not be eaten himself. So this type of attention, to make sure you're not eaten by any kind of predator, has to pay a generalized broad type of attention that is open to hearing rustling of the leaves in the forest. It's open to the reality around it to detect predators. And that's the foundation of the two types of attention of the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere is associated with apprehending, with reaching out and getting. It's associated with power in the world. And the right hemisphere is associated with seeing reality as it really is, presenting itself to us. And yet there is a difference between human brains and animal brains in the sense that what kind of power do humans exert in the world? And humans' really superpower is our ability to deal with language and symbols and models of the world. So in humans, the left hemisphere is in charge of building maps of the world, where the maps have the purpose of exerting power and apprehending things in the world. And the right hemisphere is in charge of the territory if the left is in charge of the map. And moreover, the left hemisphere not only builds the map, but also sometimes projects its map onto what it sees in the world. So if you've ever been talking to somebody and you're trying to communicate, but you feel like they're trying to fit you in a box or fit something you're saying into some model they have of the world or model they have of people like you that doesn't fit, and you're like, no, that's not it, but they keep on fitting you into that box, that's sort of the way the left hemisphere perceives the world and interacts with the world. Whereas the right hemisphere, when that's sort of the dominant way of interacting with someone, you're open to hearing what they have to say, even when it doesn't fit with their pre-existing notions. The left and right hemispheres also perceive value differently, where the left hemisphere perceives value as that which gets me something that I want, that which serves my power. So with the left hemisphere, everything becomes an instrument to attain one's desires. Whereas the right hemisphere sees value as inherent in the world. Beauty and meaning and purpose and love, all of that. It's not that those things serve a purpose that meets my needs well. It's that those things are inherently valuable, and it can see that. So when you're in a relationship and you perceive, yes, this person is viewing me as being inherently valuable, inherently worth their time, that's a more right hemisphere way of interacting. Whereas if you're in a doctor's office and you get the sense that the doctor doesn't care about you, but the doctor's just trying to meet their numbers and trying to move you through fast enough to meet their goals, that's more of a left hemisphere way of perceiving things. Now, there is this paradox here where because the left hemisphere projects its own understanding of the world onto everything, if you're projecting onto every doctor, every teacher, every church you walk into, okay, this doctor can only be acting in an instrumental way. They can only be acting with me in a way that serves their own needs. That's a very cynical outlook, and that's a very left-brained outlook. So if you inherently assume that everything you interact with is only trying to get what it wants, rather than perceiving real value in you, then that's you with your left hemisphere projecting your own image onto them. So there is this kind of slipperiness to understanding some of this content. Another hemisphere difference is that the left hemisphere sees the parts, whereas the right hemisphere sees the whole and how the parts sort of fit together in this dynamic whole. So let me give you a quote on this. It would be like trying to account for the unique quality, the power, and yes, the life of a piece of music by examining each note, or at most a phrase, in ever greater detail, outside the flow of the whole work, in the hopes that by this drilling down, as we say, there at last we will find the secret. And he digs deep into the literature of patients with right hemisphere or left hemisphere damage, either through physical damage to the brain or through a stroke or whatnot. And what are the experiments where you're getting these different patients to interact with whatever the experimenters set up? Now, what about emotions with the two different hemispheres? And as you might imagine, the right hemisphere is much better at theory of mind, at understanding other people's emotions, at contending with one's own emotions as they're sort of buried inside one's spirit. But the left hemisphere actually does have a few emotions that are more attached to the left. So one of these actually is happiness. And of course, if you live in a world of your own creation where you have infinite power, that might be attached to happiness. The two others are going to be anger and disgust. And both anger and disgust are really power-oriented emotions. They're emotions of you trying to get something you want in the world or trying to impose your will onto the world. And I would actually say both of these emotions chase truth into hiding. Like if you're interacting with someone and you use disgust or anger in response to them trying authentically to describe their experience or their understanding with the world, people will respond to that by not sharing things with you, by hiding what they really feel, think, or say. And therefore, when a person uses these emotions, they are inherently forcing their projection onto the world and causing reality to hide. The right hemisphere is better at seeing the types of reality that are kind of elusive or that cannot be fully described in words. Love, humor, beauty. If you try to describe these with words, you'll find the words to be insufficient. Very little that we take for granted as most essential to life. Love, energy, matter, consciousness, can be convincingly argued about or even described without becoming ultimately self-referential. You have to experience it to know it. All we can do is point. And a lot of these difficult to grasp things are a little bit paradoxical in nature. There are rational goals that a rational person ought to pursue, which nonetheless can only be achieved by not pursuing them. Along with sleep and happiness, these include things as diverse as wisdom, sexual performance, sympathy, and being natural. The direct approach destroys its object. So what exactly is his thesis regarding the two hemispheres? And his thesis is that the right hemisphere needs to be the master, and the left hemisphere needs to be the emissary, or the servant. And this is actually the title of another book he wrote, The Master and His Emissary. I've read both books. Both are great, but I would actually recommend starting with The Matter with Things. But the thesis is so powerful. And to think about this, we can think about the map and the territory analogies. A map may be very helpful in orienting you in the world and helps you to understand aspects of it better. It can help you see further, but only when what it tells you has been returned to the world in front of your eyes. If you start to believe the map is the world, you are lost. And what exactly does it look like to put the right hemisphere in charge? Well, it means you start by looking at what is in the world, what is of value, what really matters. You give that information to the left hemisphere to build maps and use maps. And then you hand the map back to the right hemisphere to detect anything that doesn't match with reality, to be in conversation with the left hemisphere. So his thesis is not throw out the left hemisphere, it's evil, it's bad. As a matter of fact, he talks about the necessity of the two and the generative nature of the two working together. But it's not an equal relationship between the two if you want a healthy individual personality, a healthy society. It has to be the right hemisphere coming first. And another analogy that comes up a lot in the book that helps us think about how to put the right hemisphere in charge is the analogy of the engineer engineering a machine versus the gardener cultivating the garden. And as you might imagine, it's the left hemisphere that likes the engineer analogy, where the machine is entirely under the will and control of the engineer. And a lot of modern society sort of treats everything, including living systems and people and nature and all of this, as if it were mechanical, by projecting its own image of, yes, it would be great if everything could submit to my will. Whereas the right hemisphere image here is much better depicted by the gardener and the garden, where the gardener has to attend closely to the needs and the desires of the plants in the garden, what causes them to grow and thrive. And the gardener in many ways co-creates the garden with the will and desire, if I can use those words, of the plants in the garden. And any sort of healthy human system should use the gardener analogy, should attend to the true thriving and true needs of the people inside it, the animals and plants inside of it, rather than trying to force them into its own mechanical way of being. No machine is capable of love, yet love is creative and curative. I love that. Curative and healing ways of shaping the world have to use more of the gardener analogy and less of the machine analogy. Now, the second part to his thesis that I want to bring out is that the type of attention we pay to the world cultivates the world into being. That the type of attention can either humanize or dehumanize, heal or suppress. It can either bring out the most beautiful possible potential in a person or an area or an animal or whatever, or else it can impose its will in a way that shrinks the possibility of that person. And he says that attention is a moral act, and attention is a creative act. Attention actually brings about what will truly exist in the world. And he rejects both the postmodernist The world is entirely a creation of our own projections. He rejects that. He also rejects the world is out there and does not respond to us in any way. It's just sort of out there and we're sitting in it, but not interacting with it. Rather, we are co-creating the world through the type of attention that we pay to it. Attention changes the world. How you attend to it changes what it is you find there. What you find then governs the kind of attention you will think it appropriate to pay in the future. The choice we make of how we dispose of our consciousness is the ultimate creative act. It renders the world what it is. It is therefore a moral act. It has consequences. Paying a certain kind of attention, you can humanize or dehumanize, cherish or strip of all value. By a kind of alienating, fragmenting, and focal attention, you can reduce humanity, or art, sex, humor, or religion to nothing. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about my experience reading the book, because my sense is that other people will have similar experiences, even coming from a different starting point. So we sort of go through life, and I think most people have some intuition about reality that comes from our right hemisphere that is true and meaningful and where the value exists in the world, like inherently, not just as an instrument for our own power. We do experience that. But the world sort of shuts down our ability to talk about that because it sort of forces us to explain. Oh, if you can't explain that in words, that's not really real, you're stupid, whatever. The world just does this. We kind of inherit this filter that will stop us from expressing things that cannot be expressed well in words. And that stops us from being able to experience them fully as we share them in community with others. But I think what people will experience, at least what I experienced, is as you're going on this journey through life, you are moving towards something that's real, you're interacting with it, and it's this journey you're on. And this book felt to me like it almost supercharged that journey. By taking things that I had framed in one way and they were real truths, but sort of not solidifying, but sort of giving me a frame that it's like, oh, that is the real thing. That's what I was trying to get at through these other ways of thinking. So let me just give you a couple of examples. I have always thought that the mark of intelligence is an ability to hold two things that are seemingly contradictory at the same time, to learn and understand about both without immediately rejecting and immediately trying to resolve them. And if you can do that, I think oftentimes you find that in the right moment or with the right real life experience, you find a moment when you're able to resolve some of these. And that's sort of growth. I think that's spiritual growth, that's intellectual growth. That's an experience I've had over and over. And he reframed this as saying, instead of, okay, this is a mark of intelligence, he says, no, this is a reality about truth. It's a reality about the world, that seeming opposites oftentimes are not irreconcilable. And the deepest truths do come from reconciling these. This is a mark of right hemisphere perception reality. So let me give you a quote. And this is a Jacob Needleman quote that McGilchrist pulls out. Stay with the contradiction. If you stay, you will see that there is always something more than two opposing truths. The whole truth always includes a third part, which is the reconciliation. And he uses this magnet analogy where you have two poles of a magnet. And if you try to chop off one of the poles, it's not that you actually chop off that pole, you just make the magnet shorter and it still has the two poles. So the left hemisphere wants to chop off one end of that magnet to sort of fit better into its own models. Another example he gives is poisons versus medicines. All substances are poisons, depending only on the dose. Think of any medicine. If you take enough of it, it's going to poison you. If you take just the right amount, it could heal you. Even water can destroy you. You'll drown if you get too much of it. So that's one way that these reconcile, although they don't always reconcile in such a nice, clean way. He's essentially rejecting the left brain true-false binary. Either it's true or it's false. A better question is, when is this true and when is it not true? Moreover, he claims that these seemingly opposite things are actually creative and generative when you don't reject one side or the other. You can actually realize that the reconciliation itself has energy to it. Oppositions are the ground of energy. Civilizations also flourish when they remember this, and fail when they forget. And sometimes in our public dialogues, we have two sides that are at war with each other, where both sides are honestly a left brain grab at power. So let me give you another quote here. Both the views currently on offer in so much public debate today, naive positivism and naive deconstructionism, are typical left hemisphere fictions. Each is an ill-concealed power grab, completely lacking in subtlety, and devoid of any sense of our true connection with the world. The betweenness in which fidelity can operate has been lost. That is only understood properly by the right hemisphere. Another truth about reality in this framework that I have found so helpful is the truth that reality is usually asymmetric. And he goes deep into this. He talks about art and the golden ratio and all this stuff. But I've noticed since reading that part that I'm constantly struggling against some foe in my imagination, which is really coming from the public dialogue, that is constantly trying to force me to make everything equal. Like either it's this or that, or they're exactly equal. And I'm constantly trying to push against that when I'm thinking through things in my head. And this realization has allowed me to just sort of let that go and be like, no, reality is asymmetric. I'm okay with that. I don't need to come up with an argument that things aren't exactly equal. And of course, for me, this comes in when I talk about, okay, we need to understand both sides of a debate. Oftentimes the world comes at you with, if you're bringing in both sides, you're inherently making those two sides exactly equal. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Can I make a good argument that, no, I don't think they're equal? I can, but sometimes it's just exhausting to constantly make that argument. And with what he gives me in this book, I feel this relief that the burden of proof is not on me that I have things being asymmetric. I think in some ways the burden of proof is if you think things are exactly symmetric, burden of proof is on you. Now, what is his methodology for approaching the book? And he's a neuroscientist, he's a psychiatrist, and he goes deep into philosophy and has been a professor at All Souls College. And these different realms really come together beautifully in the book, because part of the book is looking at the academic literature on the left brain and the right brain. And yet this is backed up with his experience as a psychiatrist, working with patients, listening to their stories. He brings in a lot of voices from people with schizophrenia and autism and right hemisphere or left hemisphere damage to sort of complement the academic studies that he talks about. And then the philosophy is so deep. It's the philosophy of truth and epistemology, which is how we know what is true in the world. There is so much deep philosophy in there. So the book really combines all of those. Now, part 2 of this book is Pathways to Truth. It's given the two hemispheres, how do we go about pursuing truth? And he looks at the 4 ways of pursuing truth: science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And the thing is, he does not say science and reason are left hemisphere and intuition and imagination are right hemisphere. Not that at all. Let me give you a quote. I suggested that we should reject the common simplistic idea that science and reason are the domain of the left hemisphere and intuition that of the right hemisphere. Instead, we saw that each hemisphere contributes to each of them, but in a consistently different way and to different degrees depending on what is meant by each term. The second volume really lays out how should we perceive reality? What should be our myth, our narrative that we place onto reality as we try to pursue it. And I'm, again, not going to go too deep into this, but I want to say a few things about this. Well, first of all, the first chapter in this is Coincidentia Oppositorum. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's this notion I've already talked about seemingly opposites, seemingly contradictory things being reconciled in a way that's just a part of the nature of truth. He has a chapter on the whole and the parts and how those fit together. You notice he uses the term right hemisphere and left hemisphere. And I think the reason he does that is it doesn't separate them as two separate things. They are part of a whole. He has a chapter on time where he gives us some new ways of thinking about, instead of causality as we currently think about it, how can we add complexity? Given that our minds think in images, and of course we think of time as a line, that's oftentimes how we conceptualize it. But that image can mislead us, so he helps us to get unstuck from the images we have in our head of time. Of course, that includes, the chapter on time includes the notion of potential. And of course, potential, I think, is one of the important things when we think about why does our perception, our attention, create the world? And that partially has to do with potential. He has a chapter on space. And of course, he talks about asymmetry in that chapter. He also talks about depth, where we kind of know what it means when somebody says a book is really deep versus shallow, or a piece of music is deep, or a conversation is deep. And here's some quotes. The left hemisphere has a problem dealing with depth, whether that be depth in space, in time, or in emotion. I resonate with Paul Tillich's judgment. The decisive element in the predicament of Western man in our period is his loss of the dimension of depth. He has a chapter on the relationship between consciousness and matter, which is way beyond what I can explain in a video like this. But I will say, if you've heard it all about quantum physics and about how these physicists have noticed in a particular experiment that what actually manifests in the physical world seems to depend on whether or not there is an observer, whether or not somebody is watching it happen. And that's a really weird result from physics. But he kind of argues that actually that has opened the mind of physicists to new ways of understanding consciousness and the material world. He has a chapter on value where he looks at goodness or righteousness, beauty, meaning, truth. He has a chapter on purpose that is beautiful. I won't even try to explain it right here. He has a chapter on the sense of the sacred, where he talks about left hemisphere versus right hemisphere versions of religion. Of course, left hemisphere includes dogma, and that includes religions such as atheism and secular religions, secular ways of understanding value and meaning in the world. One interesting thing in this chapter is that he notes that most religions throughout history have had limitations on the use of the word God, in recognition that the word cannot capture the thing it's really trying to capture, which is true of basically almost anything we might talk about. Like, can words capture how a person looks? And like, can you say, okay, they have brown hair and bangs and whatever? And no, you cannot know how a person looks until you actually see them, because words just don't capture it. And one analogy that he uses at some point in the book is that it's like a fishnet, where the words are the net. And they're trying to capture a reality, but all you get, I think he says, is the drippings of the fishnet with your words. You don't get the real reality. You have to taste the pineapple. No set of words can describe what pineapple actually is experienced like. And the same, of course, is true of God, where at some point he says people in religious groups often recognize you cannot talk about something as deep and profound as this sacred thing you're pursuing, and yet you have to talk about it. And there's this uncomfortable paradox in that. But of course, paradox is part of his depiction of reality. The engineer and the gardener come up in this chapter, where God as engineer, who's perfectly controlling everything, is actually not a good depiction of that which exists, which is co-creating reality with us. God as gardener, co-creating with beings who have free will, that's a much better depiction of the reality here. And he does not deny the existence of evil. And yet there's an asymmetry between good and evil in the sense that the good can encompass the evil, but the reverse is not true. Now, I want to come back to the notion of myth and the way he lays this out as a myth, because all societies operate on top of myths. And the question is, do those myths point that society toward the valuable, the truly inherently valuable, the good, the beautiful, the loving, the kind, whatever it is? Do those myths point the society in the direction of that, of truth? Or do the society's myths point them toward a road that puts the left hemisphere in charge? And let me read you a quote on this. It's a fairly long quote, but I think it's worth it. "This is all very well," someone might say, "but it is a myth. That, of course, is true, but it doesn't deliver the hoped-for knockout blow. Just as there is no option to think without metaphor, there is no such thing as not having a myth. Those who think they don't have a myth have merely bought into the prevailing myth of the time. In our case, the myth of the machine, so thoroughly that they are not even aware of it. Our only option is to espouse a worse, or one hopes a better, myth. I have argued that myths, like metaphors, are by no means lies that are invented, but aspects of truth that are discovered, and form an inevitable, indeed crucial part of the search for that truth. Myths oversee or underwrite what we are capable of seeing. The nature of the attention that we bring to bear on the world, and the values which we bring to the encounter, change what we find, and in some absolutely non-trivial sense, change what it is. This is a story that every person can be called into. And I want to explain how this manifests for me. So as I read this, one thing that seemed almost weird to me was that he was not applying this stuff to human relationships. Interpersonal relationships, if you're to understand them in this way, it makes so much sense. And yet all of his examples are kind of about people versus art or people versus physics or whatever. And it just seemed like that was missing from his salience frame. And the same with any kind of social science. He doesn't really talk that much about anthropology or sociology, even though he talks about the problem with scientific institutions and he gives plenty of evidence in that realm. He does not talk about the sociology of scientific communities. And that seemed almost weird to me. But then I had to look at it and say, wait a second, what he's saying is each person has their own unique character of the way they perceive the world. And one person's way of perceiving the world, one person's what I would call salience frame, the things that come forth to them, the things that become really prominent to them, the things that get pushed to the side for them, it's different for every person. And it can still be beautiful in that difference. So social sciences, economics, and human relationships, these are things that are very strongly in my salience frame. Physics is more in his salience frame, music. We have different salience frames, and yet I know that the framework he's setting up, people can move into that framework with their own unique way of paying attention to the world. And I think that's why it calls everybody to do this. Oh, another example of something that felt like it was missing from the book for me was the notion that we tend to perceive the right hemisphere stuff for our in-group. And when we look at out-groups, we tend to see the out-group as only being made up of their maps. The out-group is totally left brain, and the right group is understood by our full reality. With the in-group, we judge everybody by their potential. We judge everybody by not the map, but the way the map can point us to a more beautiful reality. Whereas the out-group tends to get the left hemisphere version of itself projected onto itself. And he didn't mention this ever in the book. And that's not even a critique. The point here is that the story is incomplete. And we are all called into the story wherever we're starting from. We're called into the story to be co-creators, co-gardeners of this world that we inherit.